Hi, my name is Ray Mathis, and welcome to the presentation I'm doing for American School Health Association, title being Three Simple but Highly Effective Ways to Help Students Dramatically Improve Their Mental and Emotional Health and Freedom to Make Healthier Choices. As you go through this, I'd like you to consider the relevance of what I present to the many issues we face in our country. For example, the opioid epidemic, the mass or school shootings we've seen a lot of, suicides, political division, and even racism. Now, the three ways I'm going to talk about today are: one, to teach and encourage young people to choose to have unconditional self-acceptance, or USA, to choose to develop an internal locus of control, and to recognize irrational thinking in themselves and others, and to correct it in themselves and challenge it in others. Now, I learned real early in my career that the real underlying problem was that too many of my students generated a dysfunctional amount of emotion in response to their past and current life events in and outside of school. By dysfunctional amount of emotion, I mean more than is necessary or helpful, more than they want to have, more than they know what to do with, and a type and frequency, intensity, and duration, FID, that works against them instead of for them. Now, I was always looking for a way to help my students better manage what went on inside their own heads. And one day I went to complain to a counselor friend at my school, and he listened patiently for a while. And then he finally said, "Look, Ray, it's your choice how you want to feel." And I didn't necessarily take it very well. But then he explained to me Dr. Albert Ellis's ABC theory of emotions. And he told me that there were graduate classes for teachers in the Chicagoland area in what's called rational emotive behavioral therapy, REBT, and rational emotive behavioral education, REBE. Now, one of my favorite Dr. Ellis's quotes is, "Therapy should be educational," and it often isn't, "and education could be very therapeutic." And I really believe in the latter. And I really truly believe that if we give people or anyone the right tools, they can and will do much to help themselves. Now, one of my guiding principles as a teacher was always, the trick is to be simple enough to be good. And the nice thing about REBT and REBE is that they are just that. They're simple enough to be good. Now, about the time I retired from the classroom in 2007, social emotional learning just blossomed. And I don't pretend to know all about all the different curriculums that are out there, but it seems that most of them are largely about increasing awareness and acceptance of emotions, which brings to mind a quote that's on the radio commercials that I listen to periodically from creditrepair.com. It says, "What's the point of knowing your credit score if you're not going to do anything to fix it?" Well, that's the same with REBT and REBE. They're all about fixing how you feel. Now, Dr. Ellis used to make a distinction between getting better and temporarily feeling better. And there are a lot of ways to temporarily feel better. Some are healthy, some are not. Like yoga, meditation, exercise are healthy, but others, like smoking, drinking, using drugs, are not. Now, by getting better, we mean permanently reducing the frequency, intensity, and duration of troublesome emotions. Now, the only real way to get better is to change the way you think. Now, I took what I learned in the classes, 30 hours of postgraduate classes in REBT and REBE, and I developed for my students what I call the mental and emotional toolkit for life. Now, I'm going to start with tool 2, because that's where we usually start with students. It's called unconditional self-acceptance, or USA. Now, the reason USA is important is that it helps defend against shame. And if you understand how shame comes about, it's easy to see there's a lot of it out there. And it comes about when you believe you're not living up to your own or others' expectations. There's a lot of that going on, much more than most people realize. Now, I developed a paradigm for explaining the troubles that troubled and troublesome students deal with, the internal struggles, and it's ESP, estrangement, shame, and powerlessness. And every time we hear about one of these school shootings, I can't help but think this is a perfect example of ESP. Now, shame can be a primary or secondary disturbance. And by primary disturbance, we mean it's the primary feeling someone seeks relief from through drugs, alcohol, dropping out of school, or suicide. By secondary disturbance, we mean shame makes people want to keep what they think, feel, or do, or who they are perhaps, a secret. It makes them less likely to seek or accept help that is available. Now, keeping secrets can have a tragic outcome, even suicide. Now, the reason is because they repeat irrational thoughts to themselves, like what we used to call a broken record, without the kind of challenge they would normally get if they said them out loud. Now, and what happens from that sheer repetition is that simple opinions about themselves, others, and life start to seem like facts, givens, and truths. and simple imaginations can start to seem like reality. And these facts, givens, and truths can become what I call the irrational logic behind all kinds of unhealthy, self-defeating, self-destructive, or violent behavior. And by irrational logic, I mean what they do is irrational because it makes their life and perhaps other people's lives worse, or maybe even ends it, but it makes sense to them because of what they've come to believe. Now, Dr. Ellis used to sum up this effect of shame by saying shame blocks change. And it's one of the reasons why it's one of the first things we work on with people. And the way we do that is try to teach and encourage them to have what we call unconditional self-acceptance, or USA, which means choosing to see anything you think, feel, say, or do as part of being human and understandable given what your life experience have been and what you have to deal with at the moment. Now, part of being human means you'll never be the first or last human being in history to think, feel, say, or do something, or make a particular mistake, or, for example, be LGBTQ. You'll always have a lot of company. Understandable means if you put other human beings through the exact same life experiences, they would probably end up thinking, feeling, saying, and doing much the same. Some might fare better, others worse, but most would probably do much the same. Understandable also means no one's perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone does the best they can at the time, given what they've been through and what they have to deal with at the moment. Now, Dr. Ellis used to always say we're all FHBs, or fallible human beings, who at times think, feel, say, and do things to make our own lives and sometimes the lives of others worse instead of better. Now, I have a couple of strategies I use to try to teach and encourage students to choose to have unconditional self-acceptance. One is to ask them to imagine that on the day you were born, we took 100 other newborns, and from that day forward, we exposed them to every single life event you've been exposed to. And what do you think they would think, feel, say, or do at this point in their life? My guess is probably pretty much the same. Strategy two is to imagine we all came with movies of our lives and that others had to view those movies when they first met us. Would they see the understandable reasons we think, feel, say, or do what we do now? And I would think the answer to that would be a yes, too. Now, I also teach them the formula nature plus nurture equals personality, where nature represents all those constants about human, psychosocial, and even physical development. Nurture represents a person's life experience, and personality represents a pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, nature plus nurture equals personality is a lot like A plus B equals C, where A is a constant, B is a variable. If A stays the same and you change B, C changes. Now, strategy four is to simply ask, do you think you're ever going to be the first human being in history to think, feel, say, or do what you do, or be the kind of person you are? Do you think you'll be the last? And if not, what does that suggest to you about what you think, feel, say, or do, or who you are? And suggest that it's part of being human because you have a lot of company. All right, there's also a thing called unconditional other acceptance, or UOA, which means choosing to look at what others think, feel, say, or do as part of being human, understandable given what their life experience have been, which may have been much different than our own. Now, the country could use a good dose of unconditional other acceptance. Now, we can, if we have unconditional other acceptance, we can still dislike or disagree with what others think, feel, say, or do. It just helps temper our mental and emotional response to what others think, feel, say, or do that we don't like or disagree with. Now, tool number one, I want to go back a step. Tool number one is understanding and appreciating the important role of emotion in everyday life. Now, I like to hyphenate the word emotion because it means energy to move. And it's energy to move to help us deal with threats and get what we want and need. Now, you always want to look at the frequency, intensity, and duration of emotions. Now, I use what I learned to develop what I call the think, feel, do thermostat model. I got the idea from staying at some cheap hotels chain, which I won't mention, where they had a little thermostat that goes up and down on the wall. You can adjust the temperature in your room. Now, we have a lot of objective ways of measuring the energy in the air, like anything from freezing up to boiling. But we also have subjective appraisals we use, or terms we use. For example, cool, warm, and hot. And then we go from really to sort of cool, really cool, sort of warm, sort of hot, really hot. We can do the same thing with feelings. We can break these different levels of energy to move into different levels. We have common indifference. We can have frustration, irritation, and annoyance. We can have anger, and then we can have a low to high frequency, intensity, and duration of each. This is the way I set up the feel portion of the think, feel, do thermostat. So you can either be calm, or you can be frustrated, irritated, annoyed, or be angry. You can have concern or have anxiety. You could have regret or remorse or shame or guilt. You could have sadness or depression, and you could have a moderate or medium frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness, or a high frequency, intensity, and duration. One of the things I was taught, saying I was taught in REBT training, and I teach my students, is a person's behavior will tend to follow his or her emotions toward his or her life events. Now, one of my rules as a teacher was always, there's two ways to make something you don't like worse: do nothing and overreact to it. And too often people do the latter. Now, so I built that into the think, feel, do thermostat. So as you turn your thermostat up and you experience anger, anxiety, shame, guilt, depression, or high frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness, you're more likely to react or overreact to a situation rather than respond to it in the best possible way, which is more likely if you have energy to move in the form of frustration, irritation, or annoyance, concern, regret, or remorse, sadness, or a moderate amount of loneliness. Now, we all have a fight or flight, and sometimes they add freeze to that response that's automatic. It's like so many other things that's a double-edged sword. It's helped our species survive and thrive, and it's probably saved a lot of lives. But it's also caused much needless conflict, injury, suffering, and death. Now, point is to tie these things together. As you turn your feel thermostat up, you end up with anger and anxiety. That's how you plug into what we call fight or flight or freeze response. Now, it may be hard to think of depression, shame, guilt, loneliness as energy to move, but they have the same effect on behavior as anger and anxiety. For example, you're more likely to do something like get drunk or abuse drugs or even attempt suicide when you're feeling shame, guilt, depression, and loneliness, versus perhaps reaching out, talking to others, and seeking some help if you felt regret, remorse, sadness, or loneliness, moderate FID of loneliness. Now, I like to tell students that anger, anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, and loneliness can make otherwise smart, well-informed people do stupid things. Now, the ultimate problem, though, is that too often people imagine threats where they don't exist or magnify ones that do out of proportion to reality. And the work of Dr. Albert Ellis does a great job showing us how and how to stop doing that. I'm going to do a little bit of that later. Now, our goal then, in my mind, should be to help them generate a more functional amount of emotion in response to their life events, to teach them how to get better instead of just temporarily feel better, and to teach them, help them become more response able, or able to respond to life in the best possible way, and to have more responsibility, or the ability to respond instead of reacting or overreacting. Now, one of the big tools for helping them do that is tool number 3, which is developing an internal locus of control. Now, locus of control is where we see our feelings coming from, what we see as the cause of them. Now, you can have an internal, or sometimes the word is inner, locus of control, or you can have an external one, or outer. Now, the vast majority of people walking the planet have an external locus of control. They wrongly see what happens and what others say and do as the cause of how they feel. Now, you need only listen to the way they talk about their feelings to see that. For example, that, or he, she, or they really ticks me off. That really stresses me out. That's really depressing. They hurt my feelings, or that hurt my feelings. That really makes me feel guilty. That puts a lot of pressure on me, or that makes me so happy, or he makes me so happy, she makes me so happy. Now, if you wrote a formula for how most people look at things, it would be something like this: the event equals the feeling, or somehow the event directly causes the feeling. We've heard the term big lie a lot lately in the political and politics in the United States. Well, this is an original big lie and a quite pervasive one. Now, the problems with an external locus of control is it puts people at the seeming and needless mercy of others and their life events. It gives others seeming power and control over their emotional destiny that others really don't have. People give away the real power and control they do have over their emotional destiny, and that typically causes them to feel worse than necessary or helpful. And it can cause people to feel like a victim, powerless to feel better. It also implies that others or life must change for the better in order for them to feel better. Well, my question is always, what if they don't? What if those things never change? And most importantly, it causes them to miss opportunities to feel better. Now, there's a formula for how life actually unfolds, and this is what it looks like. Now, and put that into words, anything that others say or do or that happens is just an event in our lives. Thoughts cause feelings, not events. Behavior will tend to follow a person's emotions toward his or her life events. And the last statement I teach is attitude is always the father of behavior. Now, if you think, just so you don't think this is some new idea, over almost 2,000 years ago, Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher, one of Ellis's favorites, said men are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. Now, we teach young people all kinds of formulas for how life works and how to use that knowledge to their advantage. We neglect to teach them this simple formula that governs every waking moment of their lives. We allow them to go through 12 or more years of formal education without ever challenging or correcting this big lie. Part of the reason it happens is because teachers believe the big lie. For example, you're not going to hear teachers saying, I'm driving myself crazy over what these kids are doing. They're going to say, these kids are driving me crazy. And many young people will struggle through school because we don't correct or challenge that big lie, and sometimes throughout their entire adult lives. Now, the formula event plus thoughts equals feelings and behavior is like A plus B equals C, where A is a constant, B is a variable. If A stays the same, you change B, C changes. Well, Dr. Ellis's ABC theory of emotions, the A was activating event. It can be real or imagined. And beliefs are what your beliefs about that event, yourself, others, and life. And consequences are what you feel and do as a consequence of what you believe about the event, yourself, others, and life. Now, we all have a host of cognitive choices we make all the time. You're making them right now. How we look at things, what meaning we attach, what we focus on, what we compare things to, what we remember about the past at any given moment, what we imagine will happen in the future, what we expect of ourselves, others, in life, and how much importance we attach to what does happen. Now, the problem is that because of rehearsal and practice, people develop many, what Dr. Ellis called automatic irrational beliefs, and what Dr. David Amen calls automatic negative thoughts, or ants. And Dr. Amen says people have ant problems and need to get an anteater. And this causes people to lose sight of the many cognitive choices they have. Now, the key point here is that there's always more than one way to look at anything or make the other choices. Some ways we might make these choices will make us feel better, others worse. Some ways will help us cope and deal with what we don't like, and others will make it harder. Now, and the logic to all this is, since thoughts cause feelings, not events, and we always have more than one way to look at anything, and therefore a choice as to how we do, it logically follows that it's your choice how you want to feel. Now, I also teach students that no one upsets you, you upset yourself, and try to encourage them to believe that you're responsible for how you feel, not others. It's not your job, not their job to make you feel good, it's yours. Now, but I want you to remember that our default philosophical position is always anything we think, feel, say, or do is part of being human and understandable given what our life experience have been and what we have to deal with at the moment. Now, to strike this balance, I always think of the old-fashioned doctor scales, which we don't see anymore, where you had to slide a weight left or right to get a balance. Well, sometimes you want to slide toward the default philosophy. Anything you think, feel, or say or do even is part of being human and understandable. And that's to avoid the shame that can block change. But if you want to get better, you want to go with the philosophical position that it's your choice how you look at things. It's your choice how you want to feel. Now, Dr. Ellis was big on what he called semantic or scientific precision and correctness, which means talking about things the way they really are. Now, these are some incorrect or imprecise ways to talk about things. He ticks me off. They make me nervous. That was really depressing. They put pressure on me. These kids drive me crazy, and he makes me so happy. The reality is that no one upsets you, upsets yourself. You make yourself nervous. You're depressing yourself about that. Pressure comes from inside us, not outside. You're driving yourself crazy, and no one can make you happy, and you can't make others happy either. Now, one of the ones I want to specifically talk about here is a very important one. People talk a lot about somebody hurting my feelings. Now, have you ever seen a feeling? Not what someone looks like when they have a feeling, but an actual feeling. Well, that's impossible because it's some internal biochemical event, electrical event. Now, have you ever held a feeling in your hand? Of course not. So if you can't see a feeling and can't hold it in your hand, how can you hurt a feeling? So that whole sense that, you hurt somebody's feelings is kind of nonsensical. Now, what's really going on is we all have what's called a symbolic self, the person we want to be and be seen as by others. And when people attack us verbally or with cyber attacks, that becomes a perceived threat to our symbolic self. And a threat to the symbolic self gets treated the same as a threat to life and limb by the brain. Now, it's one of the many ways we manufacture threats where they don't exist and magnify ones that do out of proportion to reality. Now, when I was a kid, we were taught Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, today we tell kids words hurt. Well, my question is, which is true? Well, the reality is that words are really just an event in our life, and hurt is a feeling. And what's in between is the thoughts, what we think about others and what they say or do. That's what really determines whether we feel hurt or not. When I was a kid, there was a perfect example of this. I used to watch people say, I know you are, but what am I? Whenever somebody would call them a name or tease them about something, I know you are, but what am I? And they were impervious to those attacks. They were invincible, powerful, and in control. But the moment they started thinking, how dare you say that about me? Then the hurt and anger came up. Now, so a more semantically precise way to describe what happens is sometimes, but not always, because of what we choose to think about others and what they say or do, we understandably make ourselves feel what we call hurt. Now, it's perfectly understandable and part of being human that kids would end up feeling hurt by what others might say or do. And we should do everything we can to appeal to the humanity, to get them to not say potentially hurtful things to others. We're actually obligated to provide a safe environment for every child. But anything others say or do is just an event in our formula. Now, one of the spin-offs for the mental and emotional toolkit was what I call mental and emotional karate, which means teaching people to defend themselves mentally and emotionally against verbal and cyber attacks, the way we teach some to defend themselves against physical attacks in real karate classes. Now, it's what I call an inside-out approach to the problem of bullying versus an outside-in approach where we try to stop the bullying. And this inside-out approach, we try to harden the potential targets. Now, teaching and encouraging people to develop an internal locus of control is a big part of that. Now, two of the famous quotes I use as part of that teaching is one is from Eleanor Roosevelt, no one can make you inferior without your consent. The other one's from Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor. He said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Now, the short version is your last freedom is your attitude. Now, what I envision a black belt in mental and karate, emotional karate would mean is someone gets to the point where that their automatic response to somebody attacking them would be, you can think, feel, say, or do whatever you want about me. That's your choice. But it's my choice how I look at and feel about myself and what I do. You don't get to make those choices for me unless I let you, and I choose not to. Now, part two of developing an internal locus of control is learning and reminding yourself what you do and don't control, and focusing on and working with what you do control instead of what you don't. Now, I used to draw a circle, what I call a circle of conflict on the board, and I would write the formula we have in two halves of it, break one half into you and the other half into them, write the formula twice. So whatever somebody else says or does is an event for us. We generate thoughts about that, maybe some feelings like anger. We say or do something back, and then that becomes a new event for them. And we go around this circle, and it can happen quite quickly, and conflicts can escalate very quickly because of it. Well, the question you used to always ask is, when looking at this, which half of the circle do we have control over? And I've never had anybody get that wrong. Now, the reality is many people think, talk, and act as if they can control what others think, feel, say, or do, but we only control what we think, feel, say, or do. And for most people, that's a big enough job. Now, most people spend too much time and energy trying to control things they can't, which is what others think, feel, say, and do, and too little time and energy trying to control what they can, what they think, feel, say, and do. And it's why what they say and do often doesn't work, and sometimes even makes things worse. Now, the more you try to control things you can't, the more out of control your life will feel. For example, the more anger, anxiety, and depression you'll experience. The more you focus on and work with what you do control, the more in control you'll feel. Part three of developing an internal locus of control is to learn to not take unnecessary responsibility for how others make themselves feel. Now, taking unnecessary responsibility for how others make themselves feel can make it more difficult for someone to negotiate on his or her own behalf and make the healthiest choice. Some others may use it against you to manipulate you. And the way to reason through this is if we go back to our formula, anything we say or do is just an event for others. They have the same cognitive choices we have, and it's their choice how they want. Therefore, it's their choice how they want to feel. No one upsets them, they upset themselves. Now, one of the things I've heard many times in my life where a parent or coach will say, go out there and make me proud of you. Well, a child can't do that. It's a parent's or coach's choice whether they want to feel pride or not. Now, we are responsible for what we say and do, but not necessarily for how others make themselves feel about it. They can upset themselves as little or as much as they want to. Now, I don't want someone to not care about how other people feel. That's too little. I don't want them to also, I also don't want them to think it's my fault they feel that way. That's too much. So something just right would be the way they feel is understandable. Have you or UOA or unconditional other acceptance, but it is their choice how they want to feel. Now, tool number 4 is to recognize irrational thinking in yourself and others, what I call cognitive missteps. Now, Dr. Ellis identified 4 basic types of irrational thinking. One's called demanding, another is called awfulizing, third is called can't stand it-itis, and fourth one is called label and damning. I'm going to go through each one of these. Now, there's 3 basic ways using the think, feel, do thermostat. This is the think portion of it. There's 3 basic ways you can look at something. You can not care about it, you can want it, or you think you need it. And then you could sort of not care or really not care. You could sort of want or really want. You could sort of think you need it or really think you need it. Now, the cognitive missteps, or the problem, according to Dr. Ellis, is people start to think they need things they simply want, start to treat simple preferences as necessities, and start to demand what they simply desire. Now, so they basically turn their thermostat from want, preference, and desire up to need, necessity, and demand. Now, Dr. Ellis used to talk about what he called a perceived need. Someone thinks they need something, but it's not like air, water, or food. It's nice to have, but they can live without it, and they're not going to die if they don't get it. Now, I taught my students 5 rules. Rule number 1 was you have a right to want whatever you want. Rule number 2 was the bigger the difference between your expectations and reality, the more emotion you'll generate. Now, William Shakespeare reportedly said, expectation is the root of all heartache. Now, what happens is if I don't care about something, there's little or no threat if I don't get what I want, and I lose it or simply imagine doing either. But once I start to want, prefer, or desire something, now the possibility of me not getting it or losing it or just simply imagining both creates a certain amount of perceived threat. But if I turn my thermostat up to thinking I need it, it's a necessity, and demanding it, now the perceived threat gets much larger when I don't get it, lose it, or imagine doing either. Now, and this is how this is like the total think, feel, do thermostat. So by setting my thermostat at need, necessity, and demand, I predispose myself to having anger instead of frustration, irritation, and annoyance, anxiety instead of concern, depression instead of simple sadness, shame and guilt rather than regret and remorse, and a much higher frequency, intensity, duration of loneliness, and more likely to predispose myself to be more likely to react or overreact to what happens. Now, what I want to mention, because loneliness is often something people struggle with quite a bit, and that happened during the pandemic quite a bit. Loneliness is not caused by being alone. Being alone is just an event and a formula. It's what you think about being alone that actually causes loneliness, or doesn't. Now, for example, if I don't care about to be with somebody and they're not there, there's no threat and there's low frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness. Once I start to want, prefer, or desire to be with somebody, and then if they're not there, that'll create a medium amount of threat or a moderate amount of threat, and there'll be a moderate or medium amount frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness. But when I turn my thermostat up to thinking I need to be with that person, and they're a necessity for me to be with them, then the threat becomes much higher if they're not there, and I experience a much higher frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness. Now, people will even elevate their wants, preferences, and desires to the same level as air, water, or food in their minds. That makes not getting what they want or losing it seem like suffocating or dying of thirst or hunger. Now, rule number 3, behavior intended to satisfy a perceived need will tend to win out over behavior intended to satisfy a rational preference. Now, here's a couple examples. A person wants to quit smoking. That's a rational preference for a bunch of reasons. He thinks and tells himself, I need a cigarette. I can't go all day without one. That's a perceived need. Well, what are the odds that he'll quit? Now, another one might be a person wants to wait until he or she is married to have sex, which could be a rational preference for a lot of reasons. Their partner wants, maybe thinks he or she needs to have sex, and the person thinks they need his or her partner's love. That's a perceived need. So what are the odds the person will wait? Rule number 4 is when people start to think they need things they simply want, it can make otherwise smart people do stupid things. And the reason is very simple. If you were suffocating, what would you be willing to do to get air? And the answer, of course, is anything. So if someone starts to think they need love or many other things, like they need air or possibly water or food, what might they be willing to do to get it or keep from losing it? And the answer, unfortunately, is the same thing, anything. And that's what can make otherwise smart people do stupid things. Now, tool number 5 is correcting irrational thinking yourself and challenging in others. So what do we really need? And this is a question I think really needs to be posed. Do we need love? Do we need it in the same way we need air, water, food? Do we need attention, approval, acceptance, sex, a boyfriend or girlfriend? Now, one of the things you're going to contend with is that just about every student somewhere along the way gets taught Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they'll usually bring that up and say, well, Maslow said it's all needs. Well, he did use the word needs, but the important point is he created different levels. Love and belonging, for example, is not the same as air, water, and food. Now, the other thing you have to contend with is a lot of popular music out there where people memorize and sing songs, and that literally brainwashes people into taking a certain point of view. For example, All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. Now, the way I challenge or dispute or question what people need is to say, we'll die in minutes, days, or weeks without air, water, or food, respectively. Do we need love, acceptance, approval, and other things like we need air, water, and food? Will we die if we don't get these other things? Do we need such things or just want, prefer, or desire them? Are they needs or just nice things to have? Now, the catch is this. We can set our think thermostat wherever we want to, but there will be predictable emotional and behavioral consequences for where we set it. Now, talk about demands for a few minutes here. You can make demands of others, yourself, or life. Now, and depending on where you make the demands will determine what feeling you get. Anger, for example, typically comes, but not always, from making demands of others. Anxiety comes from making demands of self before an event or demands of life. Shame and guilt come from making demands of yourself after an event has happened, and depression comes from making demands of life. Now, the essence of anger is everyone has to do what I want, be the way I want them to be. And everything has to be the way I want it to be. And there's a lot of that going on in the country right now. How old does that sound? Now, that's why we call anger a temper tantrum. Now, when people make demands, they use certain verbs or verb phrases. For example, have to, can't, should, and shouldn't, as opposed to want, like, prefer, rather, wish, or appreciate. Now, so how do we challenge these? Well, if somebody says they have to do what I tell them to. Well, why do they have to? They have to, you just want them to. They say they can't talk to me like that. Well, why can't they? They can't, or you just don't want them to. Now, essentially, you're asking, where do you want to set your think thermostat? At have to, can't, should, or shouldn't, or want to, or don't want to? Now, my grandfather taught me to answer that question a long time ago. Why do they have to? Well, no one has to do anything except die and pay taxes. And he was half right. Now, this is a simple model for how people create stress for themselves. Usually when people are really stressed out, they'll be experiencing what we call anxiety. And usually it's because they're used the phrase have to a lot, either in their thoughts, construct their thoughts with have to, or their statements out loud. And sometimes to a lesser extent, I can't, as opposed to I want to or I don't want to. Now, and they can get into a vicious cycle where they're saying I have to do something before and causing a lot of anxiety, which may impair their performance. And then afterwards saying they should or shouldn't have done something and creating a lot of shame or guilt. They can get into a really vicious cycle going back and forth. Now, so how do you challenge this? Very simply. Somebody says, I have to. It's, why do you have to? You have to or just want to? They say, I can't or I can't let something happen. Why can't you? You can't or just don't want to. Now, using this visual, perfect place for people, or best place for someone to be is at the top of I want to or I don't want to. As soon as people turn their thermostat up just slightly into I have to or I can, things start to break down. Now, with practice rehearsal, these kind of questions, challenges, and disputes can become automatic, and they literally act like grammar check on a computer. As soon as you hear yourself saying a certain thing a certain way, it challenges. Now, demands often come in the form of a question as well. For example, how dare you or how could you? Well, unfortunately, we teach that the answer is unfortunately easily. How could somebody talk to me like that? Easily. How dare somebody treat me like that? Easily. Now, I also teach students never ask a question for which you won't like the answer. And when you say how dare you or how could you, you're basically doing that. Now, Elvis used to talk and joke a lot about shoulding on yourself. And you can also shit on others and shit on life. Now, for example, the way people often become depressed is they say, this shouldn't be happening to me, or I shouldn't have to, or can't deal with this, versus I wish this wasn't happening to me, or I wish I didn't have to deal with this. Now, Ellis, if you look at some of the old film clips of him, you'll see him constantly telling people, stop shitting on yourself. And I had a colleague who was hospitalized for depression and anxiety. I remember the first day she came back to work, she wore a t-shirt that said, I'm not going to shit on myself today. And I used to jokingly tell students, shitting on yourself, others, in life just makes you feel shitty. Now, the second type of thinking is called awfulizing. There are a lot of things in life that are unpleasant, inconvenient, and uncomfortable to some degree. The mistake people make is turn their thermostat up to awful, start thinking or looking at things as if it's the worst possible thing that could be happening to me at this moment. Now, my grandfather and grandparents and father and mother used to say, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Now, rule number 5, you have a right to like or dislike whatever you want to. What the mistake people make is turn their thermostat up from don't like it to I can't stand it. And by doing that, they needlessly inflame themselves. And that's why Dr. Ellis called it can't stand it-itis. Now, some variations of I can't stand it are I hate it when, or I'll just die of. Now, by turning your thermostat up to need, necessity, and demand, you automatically set the stage or predispose yourself to think something's awful and that you can't stand it, versus thinking it's unpleasant, inconvenient, or uncomfortable, or just not liking it. Now, and the reason is very simple. If you were suffocating or dying of dehydration or starvation, that would be awful, and you literally couldn't stand it. Proof is that you die in minutes, days, or weeks. Now, so what do you do about awfulizing? Well, one of my mentors was Mark Denny, who was a school counselor in the Chicago area. He said, when someone is awfulizing, the last thing they need is someone agreeing with them. So we posed the question, is it awful or just unpleasant? Is it awful or just inconvenient? Is it awful or just uncomfortable? Now, remember, you can set your think thermostat wherever we want to, but there will be predictable emotional behavioral consequences for what we do. Now, a simple strategy you can use with young kids, and I use this with my little granddaughter, Rosie, who just turned 5, when she starts getting upset, I said, Rosie, big deal or little deal? And she's learning to answer little deal, Grandpa. And it immediately gets her to stop being really needlessly upset about something. Now, the question for can't stand it-itis is you can't stand it or just don't like it. Are you going to die or go crazy just because that happens? Now, so basically we're asking, where do you want to set your thermostat? Okay, at awful or just unpleasant, inconvenient, uncomfortable? At can't stand it or just don't like it? Now, the goal is hopefully they get to the point where they say, it's not awful, it's just unpleasant, or maybe inconvenient or uncomfortable. And I can stand it, I just don't like it. Now, the 5th type of thinking is called label and damning. Remember, rule 5 is you have the right to like or dislike whatever you want to. The mistake people make is they go from disliking someone's behavior to label and damning the person. And Ellis used to say that labeling damning is blatant overgeneralization. It's like calling an apple bad just because it has a bruise. It's condemning the doer instead of the deed. Now, so the way we challenge that is very simple. Why are they stupid just because they did that? They're stupid or just did a stupid thing. They're stupid or just did something you didn't like. They're stupid or just a fallible human being like the rest of us. Now, tool number 6 is what I call a step-by-step approach to situations. Now, Dr. Ellis came up with a 5-step approach. A is activating event, B is beliefs, C is consequences, what you feel and do, and D is disputing, and E is effective coping statements. Now, the goal is to help identify the key cause of all the needless emotion, and that's automatic irrational beliefs or automatic negative thoughts. Now, remember, the only way to really get better is to change the way you think. The activating event is very simple. It can be real or imagined. You basically ask what happened, what are you imagining will happen? Consequences, how did you make yourself feel? What, if anything, did you do? And did that make things better or worse? And then we turn to beliefs, which is actually tool 4. Recognizing when you and other people engage in irrational thinking. Now, so we try to identify the beliefs. You ask simple questions like, what were or are you thinking? What were or are you telling yourself? What was or is going through your head? Now, I use this simple chart like this to help identify demands and brainstorm demands. I would literally put this chart on the board and we would just combine the various phrases with the different pronouns, depending on what feeling we were dealing with. And we'd come up with brainstorm different types of demands. Now, then we go to disputing, which is tool 5, questioning, challenging the thoughts that we've identified. And finally, we get to effective coping statements, which is step 5. Now, we can actually create a worksheet to practice and rehearse going through these steps of this process to get them familiar with it and become automatic. Now, and I used to add an F, G, and H to Ellis's 5 steps. And F stood for functional unhappiness or functional amount of emotion, which isn't necessarily a step, it's more of an outcome. And then G was generate options, which would be step 6. And hopefully you end up with another outcome, which is healthier, happier, and more hopeful. Now, that concludes my presentation. I hope you got something out of this. I went pretty fast, but that's why I'm making the PowerPoint available. I want to mention a couple of Facebook pages I've created. One is called Mental Health Education for Mesa County and beyond. Mesa County is where I currently live in Colorado. Another one I've created is Your Choice, How I Want to Feel, Mental Health Education for America. Now, I also want to mention that I did write a book, but I'm not doing this to promote the book. I did it to memorialize what I taught my students. And I make it available to teachers and students at the cost of printing, which right now is roughly about $3.15. I don't make any money off that. I'll be glad to get you copies at the cost. My email is naturesmasterpieces@yahoo.com. And if you ever have any questions, and my phone number is 815-353-5312. And I am a mental health educator, represents the Chicago Institute for Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. We are a 501(c)(3), so we're a nonprofit, and I speak for free. So if you ever want me to speak, feel free to email me or call me. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you've learned something. Thank you very much. Bye.